He had enough money to buy the entire block, but he couldn't buy someone to wait for him at home. She had only 73 cents in her coat pocket, but she still believed she could shop for a father. The wind cut through downtown Chicago like a blade of ice, sharp and clean, slipping between glass towers and wrapping around the entrance of Bellamy's toy store, where Christmas lights blinked in cheerful defiance of the cold. Jonathan Pierce stepped out of a black town car worth more than most houses in the neighborhood, his polished shoes touching the sidewalk without hesitation, his wool coat tailored within an inch of perfection. At 52, he owned hotels in 3 states, a tech company valued in the billions, and a calendar scheduled down to the minute. What he did not own was noise inside his mansion. No laughter, no small shoes by the door. Just silence that stretched across 14,000 square feet. Across the street, pressed close to the toy store window, sat a little girl in a faded pink jacket, one size too small. Emily Carter watched a family inside the store, mother adjusting a scarf, father lifting a boxed doll from the shelf, their son spinning in circles under warm yellow lights. Emily's breath fogged the glass as she counted her coins again, whispering the total like it might grow if she said it softly enough. 73 cents. Not enough for the doll. Not enough for anything in that window. But she stayed seated, knees pulled to her chest, as if hope itself required patience. Jonathan noticed her only because she didn't move when the car engine shut off. Everyone else hurried past, collars up, eyes down. She stayed, still, waiting for something the store didn't sell. Jonathan told himself he was only observing market behavior, the way families responded to seasonal displays, the way children gravitated toward certain shelves, but he knew that was a lie the moment he remained standing on the sidewalk long after his driver had cleared his throat. The girl did not beg. She did not hold a sign. She simply watched as if memorizing a life that belonged to someone else. Snow began to fall in thin, uncertain flakes, catching in her light brown hair and clinging to the worn fabric of her sleeves. The temperature hovered just below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sting, but not cold enough to send her running. Jonathan checked his watch out of habit. 6:23 in the evening. He had a dinner reservation at a private club where men discussed mergers over $1,200 bottles of wine. Instead, he found himself walking toward the toy store window. Up close, he could see that her boots were scuffed at the toes, and her gloves did not match. She sensed him before she looked up. Her eyes were clear, steady, not frightened. Just curious. He was accustomed to being recognized. Newspapers had printed his face beside headlines about acquisitions and charitable foundations. She showed no sign of knowing who he was. To her, he was simply a tall man in a dark coat blocking part of the display. Inside the store, a mechanical train circled a miniature Christmas village. The tiny houses glowed. The painted families inside them appeared permanent, untouched by layoffs or hospital bills. The girl shifted slightly to give him room, polite even in her claiming of nothing. Jonathan glanced at the coins in her small open palm. 73 cents. He did not yet know why that number unsettled him more than any balance sheet ever had. Jonathan should have walked away. That was what he always did when something felt complicated. He solved problems with contracts, with signatures, with transfers that moved more money in a second than most people earned in a year. But the girl beside him was not a problem to be solved. She was a question that did not come with numbers. He cleared his throat gently, careful not to startle her. She tilted her head up, snowflakes resting on her eyelashes. Up close, he noticed the faint shadows under her eyes, the kind that came from long nights and thin blankets. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, his voice steady, practiced the same tone he used in boardrooms overlooking Lake Michigan. She looked back at the display instead of at him. "I am just looking," she said softly. Her voice carried no complaint, only honesty. Inside the store, a father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see the top shelf. The girl beside Jonathan followed the movement with quiet intensity. Jonathan felt something unfamiliar press against his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the cold. He remembered another winter years ago, another small hand wrapped around his finger, another promise that he had believed time would allow him to keep. The memory arrived without warning and refused to leave. The girl opened her palm again, counting her coins as if confirming reality. 73 cents. She did not ask him for anything. She did not even look at his expensive coat. She simply sat there guarding her hope like it was the most valuable thing she owned, and for the first time in a long while, Jonathan Pierce did not know what to do next. The snow began to settle in earnest, coating the sidewalk in a thin white layer that softened the sharp edges of the city. Jonathan glanced toward his car. His driver waited patiently, engine running heat on the kind of quiet loyalty money ensured. He should have returned to it. Instead, he remained beside the little girl, as if anchored there by something he did not fully understand. "It is getting colder," he said, noticing how her fingers curled tighter around the coins. She shrugged slightly. "I am used to it." The words were simple, but they did not belong to a child her age. He studied her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the way she kept her eyes fixed on the family inside the store, rather than on him. "Do your parents know you are here?" he asked carefully. That was when she finally turned to face him directly. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet evaluation, as if she were deciding whether he deserved the truth. "My mom is resting," she replied. "She gets tired a lot." She hesitated, then added, "She does not like me to worry." Jonathan felt the wind cut deeper through his coat, though the fabric was thick and expensive. He thought of the medical centers his company funded, the hospital wings, bearing his last name in polished bronze letters. He had built entire foundations in memory of what he had lost. Yet here he stood, unable to fix what was right in front of him with a simple donation. "What are you saving for?" he asked, nodding toward the glass. She looked back at the display, at the glowing miniature houses and the mechanical train circling its perfect track. "Not a toy," she said quietly. "Something else." Her voice did not tremble, but it carried a weight that made him straighten unconsciously. Around them, shoppers hurried past with bags swinging at their sides, laughter rising into the cold evening air. Jonathan Pierce, who negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking, found himself hesitating before asking the next question, because he sensed that whatever she said might change something he had carefully kept sealed for years. Jonathan felt the pause stretch between them, delicate and heavy at the same time. He was accustomed to silence bending in his favor, to people filling it quickly with proposals or apologies. The girl did neither. She simply watched the small train circle its plastic village as if waiting for it to reach a destination it would never actually arrive at. "If it is not a toy," he said carefully, "then what is it?" His voice was softer now, less like a man negotiating and more like someone asking permission to understand. She rubbed her thumb over the edge of one coin, thinking. Snow gathered along the shoulders of her pink jacket, melting into dark patches. "My mom says you can buy almost anything if you save long enough," she answered. "Food, medicine, a bus ticket." She swallowed, her gaze fixed on the glowing houses inside the display. "I was just wondering if that is true for everything." Jonathan felt something shift inside him, subtle but unmistakable. He had built an empire on the belief that everything had a price. Buildings, companies, even reputations. Not everything he said automatically, though he was no longer certain he believed it. She finally looked at him again, and this time her eyes were searching. "Do you think," she asked, slowly, as if testing each word before letting it go, "that you can buy a dad?" The question landed without accusation. It was not manipulative. It was honest in the way only children can be honest. Jonathan did not answer right away. A car horn sounded somewhere down the block. Laughter spilled from the toy store as the door opened, and a family stepped out carrying bright red bags. He felt the weight of his wallet in his inside pocket, heavy with credit cards and access to more money than most people could imagine. Yet in that moment, standing under falling snow beside a 7-year-old girl with 73 cents in her hand, he realized there were questions no balance sheet had ever prepared him to answer. The question did not sound dramatic. It did not echo or rise above the noise of the street. It simply rested between them, fragile and impossible at the same time. Jonathan felt his throat tighten, a reaction so unfamiliar that he almost mistook it for the cold air. He had been asked about acquisitions worth billions of dollars, about market risks and global expansions, about strategies that shaped industries. No one had ever asked him whether a father could be purchased. He let out a slow breath, watching it turn to fog in the winter air. "No," he said finally, his voice lower than before. "You cannot buy a dad." The girl studied his face carefully, as if measuring the truth of his answer. "Then how do you get one?" she asked. There was no self-pity in her tone, only curiosity, steady and unguarded. Jonathan looked toward the toy store window again. Inside, a man knelt to zip his son's coat, tugging the fabric up to protect him from the cold. The gesture was small, automatic. Jonathan felt it like a memory pressing against his ribs. "Sometimes," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "people become a dad by staying, by showing up, by not leaving when things get hard." He did not realize until he finished speaking that he was describing something he had once failed to do. The girl glanced down at the coins in her palm. "That sounds harder than saving money," she said quietly. He almost smiled, but the expression did not fully form. Snow gathered thicker now, coating the parked cars in white. His driver stepped out briefly, concern flickering across his face, but Jonathan gave a subtle shake of his head. "Not yet." The city lights reflected off the icy pavement, turning the sidewalk into a blurred mirror. "Where is your mom resting?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated, then nodded toward a dim apartment building 2 blocks away, its brick exterior worn and its front light flickering. "Up there," she said. "She says we will be okay. She always says that." Jonathan followed her gaze to the dark windows, and for the first time in years, a decision that could not be solved with money began to form quietly in his mind. Jonathan followed her gaze to the aging brick building 2 blocks away, its windows dim and unevenly lit, a sharp contrast to the glowing storefront behind them. He imagined the inside without needing to see it. Thin walls, radiators that clanked more than they warmed, a kitchen table with one chair slightly unsteady. He had funded luxury developments taller than that entire block, yet this small building felt heavier than any skyscraper he owned. "Does your mom see a doctor?" he asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. Emily nodded. "Sometimes. When we can." She said it matter-of-factly, like someone describing the weather. No complaint, no drama, just reality. A gust of wind swept down the street, lifting loose snow into the air. Jonathan instinctively reached out and brushed a small patch of white from her sleeve. The gesture surprised both of them. He withdrew his hand quickly, unsure of the boundary he had almost crossed. "What is your name?" he asked. "Emily," she replied. "Emily Carter." She hesitated before adding, "My mom is Sarah." The name settled into him with unexpected weight. Sarah. A real person. Not an abstract problem. Not a charity case. A mother upstairs in a dim apartment telling her daughter that everything would be okay. Jonathan glanced once more at the coins in Emily's palm. 73 cents. He reached into his coat, not for his wallet, but for a business card. He held it for a moment, then paused. A card felt transactional, cold. Instead, he slipped it back into his pocket. "Would it be all right if I walked you home?" he asked. Emily studied him again, the way she had before answering his earlier questions. "You are not going to yell at my mom, are you?" she asked quietly. "No," he said immediately. "I would never do that." She nodded once, as if that settled it. Together they stepped away from the bright toy store window, and onto the snow-covered sidewalk, leaving behind the perfect plastic village and walking toward a building where nothing was polished, nothing was guaranteed, and everything suddenly felt more important than any dinner reservation waiting across town. Together they crossed the street, their footsteps pressing into the thin layer of snow that softened the sound of the city. Jonathan walked slightly behind her, at first unsure of the rhythm, then matched her pace when she glanced back to make sure he was still there. The building up close looked older than it had from across the block. The front light flickered above a dented metal door, and the narrow steps were dusted in white. Emily climbed them carefully, counting under her breath, as if it were a habit. "Third floor," she said. "The elevator stopped working last year." Jonathan nodded, though she was not looking at him. He had not taken stairs to reach his own front door in more than a decade. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and radiator heat. The walls were painted a pale yellow that had faded unevenly over time. Emily removed her gloves and tucked the coins into her pocket before knocking gently. The sound was soft, respectful. A moment passed, then another. Jonathan felt an unfamiliar tension build in his chest. Finally, the door opened a few inches. A woman in her early 30s stood there, her blonde hair loosely tied back, her face thinner than it should have been. She looked surprised to see a tall man in a tailored coat behind her daughter. "Emily," she asked quietly, "who is this?" Emily stepped aside. "Mom, this is Jonathan. He walked me home." The woman's eyes flickered with caution, then gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice tired but sincere. Jonathan introduced himself simply, without titles, without company names. Up close, he could see how carefully the apartment had been kept, despite its size. A small couch, a folding table, a single lamp casting warm light into the narrow room. It was modest, but it was clean. It was lived in. And for reasons he could not fully explain, standing there in that cramped hallway felt more consequential than any boardroom he had entered in years. Emily slipped past her mother and set her jacket on a hook by the door, glancing once over her shoulder to make sure he had not changed his mind about coming upstairs. Sarah opened the door wider, stepping back to allow them inside. The apartment was small, no more than 600 square feet, but everything had its place. A thin blanket was folded neatly over the couch. A stack of medical envelopes sat on the corner of the table, organized but unopened. The heater clicked unevenly, fighting against the December cold. Jonathan removed his coat slowly, suddenly aware of how out of place it looked, draped over a wooden chair that had been repaired more than once. "I appreciate you walking her home," Sarah said, closing the door carefully, as if even the hinges needed conserving. Her voice carried both pride and exhaustion. "She likes to look at the lights downtown." Emily stood near the small kitchen counter, watching the two adults with quiet alertness. Jonathan nodded. "She was sitting outside the toy store," he said gently. "I did not want her alone in the cold." Sarah's expression shifted, a mix of apology and something deeper. "I told her to stay close," she replied. "I just needed to rest for a little while." The effort it took for her to stand upright was subtle but visible. Jonathan noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she reached for the back of the chair. He had seen that look before in hospital corridors, in waiting rooms, where hope was measured in appointments and insurance approvals. "Are you getting the treatment you need?" he asked carefully. Sarah hesitated, then offered a polite half-smile. "We are managing." It was the kind of answer people gave when the truth felt too heavy for strangers. Emily stepped forward, then her small voice steady. "Mom, I asked him something." Sarah's eyes flicked to her daughter, concerned. "What did you ask?" Emily looked at Jonathan, then back at her mother. "I asked him how you get a dad." The room grew quiet in a way that made the hum of the heater seem louder. Sarah inhaled slowly, her composure tightening. "Emily," she said softly, not scolding, just aware. Jonathan felt the weight of the question again, heavier now in this dimly lit apartment. Outside, snow continued to fall against the window, muffling the city. Inside, 3 people stood in a space too small for pretense. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Pierce felt something pressing in on him that could not be negotiated, acquired, or dismissed. It was responsibility, uninvited and undeniable, waiting for him to decide whether he would step back into the warmth of his car or step forward into a life that would ask more of him than money ever had. The silence that followed Emily's words did not feel awkward. It felt honest. Sarah lowered herself slowly into the wooden chair, as if conserving strength, and looked at Jonathan with an apology that needed no explanation. "She asks questions like that sometimes," she said gently. "Children notice when something is missing." Jonathan nodded, but his thoughts had already drifted somewhere far from the small apartment. He saw another winter in his mind, another small kitchen in a different home. He saw a little boy with his mother's blue eyes sitting at a breakfast table, swinging his legs because they did not yet reach the floor. He heard laughter that once filled rooms larger than this entire building. Then he remembered the business trip he could not cancel, the meeting that felt urgent at the time, the highway slick with freezing rain on the drive back. He remembered arriving too late. He had spent years burying that memory beneath expansion plans and charitable foundations, telling himself that grief could be managed the same way as risk. It could not. Standing now in a 600-square-foot apartment with peeling paint and a struggling heater, he felt that the sealed door inside him crack open. "I did not mean to upset anyone," Emily said quietly, watching both adults with concern. Jonathan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not neediness, but courage. "You did not upset me," he said carefully. "You asked an important question." Sarah studied him, as if trying to determine whether he was simply being kind or whether something deeper was unfolding. "We have managed on our own for a long time," she said. "I do not expect anything from you." The statement was firm, but not defensive. Jonathan understood it. Pride was often the last thing people held onto when everything else felt uncertain. He glanced at the stack of medical envelopes again. "Managing does not mean you should have to do it alone," he replied. The words surprised him as much as they did her. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the city in quiet white. Inside, Jonathan Pierce felt the weight of 2 lives balanced against the comfort of his old routines. For years, he had avoided the possibility of loving anything that could be taken away again. Now, in this dim apartment with its single lamp and steady child watching him, he understood that avoiding pain had also meant avoiding something far more important. Jonathan moved closer to the small table, his eyes resting briefly on the stack of unopened medical envelopes. The return addresses were from clinics and billing offices across the city. He did not need to read the amounts to understand what they represented. Sarah noticed his glance and instinctively placed her hand over the papers, not hiding them, but protecting them. "It is temporary," she said, as if rehearsed. "I start another round of treatment next month. The doctor says there is still hope." Her voice held on to that last word with careful strength. Emily stood beside her mother, one small hand resting against Sarah's arm, as if anchoring her in place. Jonathan felt the room narrow around him. He had built partnerships with hospitals, written checks large enough to fund entire wings, yet none of that felt personal until now. "What kind of treatment?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated only a second before answering. "Autoimmune complications. It affects my energy. Some days are better than others." She offered a faint smile. Tonight was not one of the better days. Jonathan nodded slowly. He could see the fatigue in her posture, the effort it took to remain upright. He looked at Emily, who was watching him, as if waiting for him to do something meaningful. "Does she miss school often?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "Number. She loves school. I make sure of that." Pride flickered through her tired expression. "She deserves normal." The word lingered in the air. Normal. Jonathan thought of his own childhood, modest but stable. He thought of the son he had lost, of the empty bedroom preserved for years, as if time might reverse itself. He had convinced himself that building an empire was a way to outrun regret. Standing here, he realized it had only postponed it. "I would like to help," he said finally, his tone steady but sincere. Sarah's eyes sharpened slightly. Help, how, she asked. It was not suspicion. It was caution earned through experience. Jonathan took a measured breath. "With the medical bills? With whatever you need, to make sure she does not have to sit in the cold outside a store again." Emily's gaze shifted between them, hopeful but restrained. Sarah looked down for a long moment, then back up at him. "Money can solve a lot," she admitted softly. "But it cannot solve everything." Jonathan knew she was right. He had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. The heater clicked again, struggling against the winter night. And in that small apartment, with snow pressing quietly against the window, the question was no longer whether he could afford to help. It was whether he was ready to step into a life that would ask him to stay. Jonathan felt the weight of Sarah's words settle into the small space between them. Money can solve a lot, but it cannot solve everything. He had built his entire identity around proving the opposite. He glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall in steady silence, covering the city in a clean white layer that made even the oldest buildings look temporarily new. "I know money is not everything," he said carefully, his voice lower now, less certain than it had been in any boardroom. "But sometimes it can buy time. And time matters." Sarah studied him, measuring not his wealth, but his intention. Emily moved closer to the couch and climbed onto it, drawing her knees to her chest as she listened. The room felt warmer despite the struggling heater, as if the conversation itself carried heat. "Why would you want to help us?" Sarah asked quietly. It was the question he had been avoiding since he stepped through the door. Jonathan took a slow breath. "Because I know what it feels like to lose time," he answered. He did not elaborate, but something in his expression shifted enough that Sarah did not press further. Emily's eyes softened, sensing the change without understanding its full history. Jonathan reached into his coat, and this time he did not hesitate. He placed his business card gently on the table beside the stack of envelopes. "Call me tomorrow," he said. "I can connect you with a specialist at one of the medical centers my foundation supports. No publicity, no obligations, just support." Sarah looked at the card, but did not touch it yet. Pride and relief moved across her face in quiet conflict. "I do not want my daughter to feel like we owe anyone," she said. Jonathan nodded. "You do not owe me anything," he replied. "If anything, I owe her for asking a question most adults are too afraid to ask." Emily tilted her head slightly at that, as if considering whether questions could carry value. The clock on the wall ticked past 7. Somewhere downtown, his dinner reservation expired without him. His driver likely wondered what had changed. Jonathan realized something had shifted the moment he chose to climb 3 flights of stairs instead of returning to his car. He stood slowly, pulling his coat back on. "I will check in tomorrow," he said, not as a businessman, but as a promise. As he reached for the door, Emily's small voice stopped him. "You are coming back, right?" The question was simple, but it carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed. Emily's question followed Jonathan down all 3 flights of stairs and out into the snow-covered street. "You are coming back, right?" It echoed louder than the traffic, louder than the wind cutting between the buildings. He paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the dim 3rd-floor window. A faint shadow moved behind the curtain. 2 lives in a 600-square-foot apartment, waiting on a promise he had not fully formed. His driver stepped out quickly, holding the car door open, confusion written across his face. Jonathan slid into the back seat without speaking. The warmth inside the car felt artificial, now detached from everything that had just happened upstairs. As the car pulled away, He watched the building shrink in the rear window, snow blurring its outline, until it looked fragile, almost temporary. He told himself he would call in the morning. He told himself he would arrange the best specialist in the city, cover every bill, secure their future from a distance. That was how he handled problems. Efficient, clean, controlled. But the memory of Emily's eyes would not allow that distance. By the time he reached his mansion, nearly 12,000 square feet of polished marble and silent hallways, the house felt colder than the street. He walked past the grand staircase, past the formal dining room, set for guests who rarely came, and stopped outside a door he had not opened in months. Slowly, he turned the handle. Inside, a child's bedroom remained preserved in careful stillness. A twin bed neatly made, a shelf of books untouched, a framed photograph on the dresser showing a younger Jonathan kneeling beside a boy with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. The ache returned with full force. He stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photograph until his vision blurred. He had promised that child he would always be there. Business had seemed urgent. Success had seemed necessary. Time had seemed flexible. It was not. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of meetings scheduled for the next morning. He silenced it without looking. Somewhere across the city, a 7-year-old girl was waiting for an answer. And for the first time since he buried his son, Jonathan Pierce felt the terrifying possibility that staying might hurt just as much as leaving. But he also understood that walking away again would hurt even more. Jonathan did not sleep that night. He remained seated on the edge of the small bed in the preserved room until the sky outside his mansion shifted from black to a pale gray. The silence of the house pressed in around him, thick and accusing. For years he had convinced himself that protecting his heart meant keeping it empty. He had built charities in his son's name, funded playgrounds, written speeches about community. Yet he had never allowed himself to step back into the simple act of being present. Emily's voice cut through every excuse. "You are coming back right." At 6:30 in the morning, he stood abruptly, as if delay itself had become unbearable. He showered, dressed, and ignored the stack of messages from his executive team waiting on his phone. Instead of heading downtown to a glass tower bearing his last name, he instructed his driver to take him back to the brick building 3 blocks from the toy store. The city looked different in the early light. Snow clung to the sidewalks in uneven patches. Delivery trucks rumbled past. When he reached the building, he did not wait in the car. He climbed the stairs again, this time without hesitation, his breath steady despite the narrow steps. On the 3rd floor, he knocked firmly but not urgently. It took longer for the door to open. When it did, Sarah stood there looking weaker than the night before, one hand braced lightly against the frame. Surprise crossed her face when she saw him. "You came back," she said quietly. Jonathan nodded, the answer simple and deliberate. "I told Emily I would." From inside the apartment, a small figure appeared at the end of the hallway, eyes wide and hopeful. Emily did not run to him. She simply stood there watching to see if he would remain. Jonathan stepped inside without waiting to be invited, not out of arrogance but out of commitment. "I scheduled an appointment with a specialist at Lakeshore Medical Center for this afternoon," he said gently. "Transportation is arranged. The consultation is covered. There will be no bills." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but he continued, his voice steady. "This is not charity. This is time. And time matters." Emily moved closer, her small hand brushing against the sleeve of his coat, as if testing whether he was real. In that quiet apartment, beneath flickering lights and peeling paint, Jonathan Pierce made a decision that no contract had ever required of him. He would not solve this from a distance. He would stay close enough to be accountable. By noon, they were seated in a quiet consultation room at Lakeshore Medical Center. The walls painted a calming shade of blue that tried its best to soften difficult conversations. Sarah sat in a wheelchair, despite insisting she could walk, her strength clearly fading faster than she wanted to admit. Emily stood close to her side, one hand resting gently against her mother's shoulder, as if lending her whatever energy a 7-year-old could spare. Jonathan remained beside them, not at a distance, not checking his phone, not glancing at the time. When the specialist entered with a folder held carefully against his chest, the air in the room shifted. The doctor spoke with compassion, explaining test results and options, outlining aggressive treatment plans that required immediate action. The words were clinical, but the implications were personal. Without intervention, Sarah's condition would worsen quickly. With treatment, there was a fighting chance. The cost was significant. Jonathan did not hesitate. "Begin immediately," he said, his voice steady, leaving no space for negotiation. Sarah looked at him, emotion flickering across her pale face. "This is too much," she whispered. He knelt in front of her wheelchair, bringing himself level with her gaze. "It is not too much," he replied. "It is necessary." Emily watched every movement, every word, her small fingers tightening in the fabric of her mother's coat. The doctor stepped out to arrange logistics, leaving the three of them alone. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah reached for Jonathan's hand, her grip light but sincere. "If something happens to me," she began, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay composed, "I do not want her sent somewhere she does not know." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Jonathan felt the full weight of what she was asking without her having to say it outright. He looked at Emily, who was staring at him with that same quiet bravery she had shown on the sidewalk outside the toy store. "Nothing is going to happen," he said firmly, though he knew life did not obey promises. Sarah's eyes searched his face. "If it does," she insisted softly, "would you stay?" There it was. Not a business proposal, not a charitable request, a life-altering question. Jonathan felt fear rise inside him, sharp and undeniable. To say yes meant opening himself to loss again. To say no meant walking away from a child who had already learned too much about absence. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then he reached out and placed his hand over Emily's small one. "I will stay," he said, not as a billionaire, not as a benefactor, but as a man choosing something that could not be bought. Emily's eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. And in that quiet hospital room, Jonathan Pierce crossed a line he could never uncross, stepping fully into the possibility of becoming what she had been searching for all along. The treatments began that same week. Appointments filled the calendar that once held nothing but corporate strategy sessions and investment briefings. Jonathan rearranged everything without hesitation. Board meetings were delegated. Conference calls were shortened. For the first time in decades, profit margins were no longer the center of his schedule. Mornings were spent in hospital corridors that smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee. Afternoons were divided between Emily's school pickup and consultations with specialists who spoke in cautious optimism. Sarah endured each procedure with quiet strength, her hand often resting in Jonathan's, as if drawing steadiness from his presence. He did not flinch from it. He remained. Word began to circulate quietly among hospital administrators that the Pierce Foundation was expanding its support for long-term autoimmune research. There were no press releases, no cameras, just signed approvals and immediate funding transfers. When one board member questioned the sudden shift in priorities, Jonathan responded with calm finality. "This is where we are needed." At the apartment, changes unfolded slowly. A new heater was installed. Fresh paint brightened the narrow hallway. Groceries arrived without explanation, always stocked with Emily's favorite cereal and the herbal tea Sarah preferred after treatments. Emily watched these changes with careful hope, as if afraid they might disappear if she acknowledged them too loudly. One evening, as snow melted into early spring rain outside the window, she sat beside Jonathan at the small folding table doing her math homework. "You came back every day," she said quietly, not looking up from her workbook. He glanced at her pencil, moving carefully across the page. "I said I would," he replied. She paused, then asked the question that had lingered unspoken since the hospital room. "Are you still staying?" He set his phone face down on the table, giving her his full attention. "Yes," he said simply. Across the room, Sarah watched them with a mixture of gratitude and something like peace. The treatments were not easy, but her strength began to return in small, measurable ways. She could stand longer. She could walk to the kitchen without steadying herself against the wall. Each improvement felt monumental. And with every appointment attended, every evening spent at the small apartment, instead of the silent mansion, Jonathan felt a transformation taking place inside him. He was no longer a visitor solving a crisis. He was becoming part of the rhythm of their lives. The city outside continued its endless movement, but within that modest space something steady and unexpected was taking root. Not obligation, not charity, but commitment. Spring arrived slowly, washing the last of the snow from the sidewalks and replacing it with damp pavement and cautious sunlight. Sarah's follow-up scans showed measurable improvement. The specialist used words like responsive and promising, careful not to guarantee anything yet hopeful enough to change the air in the room. When they left the hospital that afternoon, Emily skipped ahead on the sidewalk for the first time since Jonathan had met her, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Sarah walked beside him without needing the wheelchair. "I do not know how to thank you," she said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. "You do not have to." He meant it. Gratitude was not what he had stayed for. A week later, Jonathan invited them to visit his home. He hesitated before making the offer, aware of what that space represented. When Sarah and Emily stepped through the tall front doors, their reflections stretched across polished marble floors. Emily's eyes widened, but she did not run ahead. She remained close to her mother, as if unsure whether she belonged in a place that echoed with so much quiet. Jonathan led them down the hallway and paused outside the room he had once kept closed. He opened the door slowly. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the preserved bed and bookshelf. He had removed nothing, but he had added something small, a fresh bouquet of white flowers on the dresser. "This was my son's room," he said gently. His voice did not break, but it softened. Emily stepped inside carefully, taking in the framed photograph on the dresser. "He looks happy," she whispered. Jonathan nodded. He was. There was no need to explain further. Sarah placed a hand over her heart, understanding without words what it meant for him to share that space. After a long moment, Emily turned back toward him. "It does not have to stay empty," she said, her tone thoughtful rather than demanding. The statement hung in the air, fragile and profound. Jonathan felt something settle inside him, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as a continuation of something he had once believed was over. Later that evening, as they sat together at a dining table that had rarely been used, laughter filled the high ceilings for the first time in years. It was not loud. It was not extravagant. It was simple. And in that simplicity, Jonathan Pierce understood that healing did not erase the past. It built forward from it, one steady choice at a time. By early summer, the changes were no longer subtle. Sarah's strength had returned enough for her to resume part-time work from home, her voice steadier, her posture upright without effort. Follow-up scans continued to show improvement, and the specialist spoke now of maintenance rather than emergency. The apartment that once felt temporary began to feel transitional instead. Jonathan had quietly arranged for them to move into a smaller guest house on his property, not as charity, but as proximity. Sarah resisted at first, unwilling to lose her independence, but Jonathan made the terms clear. "This is not about control," he told her. "It is about support." Eventually, she agreed on the condition that her name remained on every document and every decision. He respected that without question. The day they moved, Emily carried a single box labeled in careful handwriting, "Important Things." Inside were her school awards, a small stuffed rabbit, and the 73 cents she had once counted outside the toy store. She kept the coins in a small glass jar on her new bedside table, not because she needed them, but because they reminded her of where everything began. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than purchased. Mornings meant breakfast together before school. Afternoons meant homework at the large kitchen island, while Jonathan reviewed foundation reports nearby. Evenings meant dinners that were no longer silent. Sarah watched the transformation with quiet gratitude, but she also noticed something deeper in Jonathan. He had begun stepping back from certain business ventures, redirecting energy toward long-term healthcare initiatives and family-centered programs. When reporters eventually caught wind of the expansion of his foundation's medical support, he declined interviews. "This is personal," he said simply. One evening, as fireflies flickered across the lawn and the sky faded into warm shades of orange and blue, Emily sat beside him on the back porch steps. "You stayed," she said, leaning lightly against his arm. He looked down at her, remembering the first night in the snow. "Yes," he answered. She hesitated, then spoke the word softly, almost testing it. "Dad." He did not correct her. He did not overreact. He simply let the words settle into the quiet air between them. Inside the house, Sarah watched from the window, her eyes reflecting both relief and peace. The question that had once seemed impossible to answer had unfolded not through a purchase, but through presence. And in that presence, something lasting had taken root. A year later, winter returned to the city, with familiar precision dusting rooftops in white and stringing lights across storefronts once again. Jonathan stood on the same block, where everything had begun, this time without hesitation, without distance. The toy store window glowed warmly against the cold evening air, mechanical trains circling their tiny village just as they had before. Beside him, Emily adjusted her scarf and pressed closer to his side, taller, now steadier. Sarah walked on his other side, her cheeks flushed from the cold, but her steps strong and even. They paused in front of the glass, watching families move inside beneath soft golden lights. Emily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small glass jar she had insisted on bringing. The 73 cents clinked softly inside. She held it up and smiled. "I do not need this anymore," she said. Jonathan looked at her reflection in the window, remembering the night she had counted those coins with quiet determination. "Keep it," he replied gently. "Not because you need it, but because it reminds you that hope can start small." Sarah slipped her hand into his, not out of dependence, but out of partnership. The three of them stood there for a long moment, not as strangers divided by circumstance, but as a family formed by choice. Snow began to fall again, soft and steady, landing on their shoulders without urgency. Emily looked up at him, her voice certain now. "You stayed," she said. Jonathan nodded, his breath visible in the winter air. "I am not going anywhere." And this time there was no fear in the promise, only peace. They stepped inside the toy store together, the small bell above the door chiming softly as warm air replaced the winter chill. The scent of pine garland and fresh packaging filled the space. Emily walked slowly past the shelves, no longer pressing her hands against the glass from the outside, but moving confidently between rows of bright boxes and polished wooden displays. Jonathan and Sarah followed a few steps behind, exchanging a glance that carried a year's worth of gratitude and growth. When Emily reached the display with the mechanical train circling its miniature village, she stopped. "It still goes in circles," she said thoughtfully. Jonathan knelt beside her, watching the tiny engine glide along its fixed track. "Yes," he answered, "but the people watching it do not." She smiled at that, then picked up a small boxed set of figurines a family meant to stand beside the train. "This one," she said. At the register, Jonathan reached for his wallet, but Emily gently placed the glass jar on the counter first. The coins clinked as she poured them out. "I want to use this," she explained. "Not because I have to, because I choose to." The cashier counted the 73 cents, and Jonathan covered the rest without comment. As they walked back outside, snowflakes settling into her hair, Emily held the small box carefully against her chest. "You cannot buy a dad," she said quietly, looking up at him. Jonathan felt the words settle deeply, not as a reminder of the past, but as a truth they had both lived. "No," he replied softly. "But you can choose one." And as they stepped into the falling snow together, the city lights reflecting in the icy pavement, it was clear that what they had built was never about purchase. It was about presence and the decision to remain. That night, back at the house, the small boxed figurines were placed carefully beside the model train Jonathan had quietly ordered and assembled in the sunroom earlier that week. The track curved in a wide oval near the tall windows overlooking a lawn now covered in fresh snow. Emily knelt beside it, positioning the tiny family figures near the painted station, adjusting them until they stood facing one another. Sarah watched from a nearby chair, a warm blanket draped across her lap, her eyes bright with a kind of gratitude that no longer carried fear. Jonathan stood behind them for a moment, taking in the scene. The room that once echoed with absence now held the steady rhythm of something alive. The train began to move, its soft, mechanical hum filling the quiet space. Emily leaned back against his leg without thinking, a small, natural gesture that spoke more than any declaration. "It is better when it is not empty," she said, watching the train glide past the miniature houses. Jonathan rested his hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes," he answered. He thought of the night he had first seen her outside the store window, counting coins in the cold. He thought of the question that had followed him home and refused to let him hide. Some moments divide a life into before and after. That winter evening had been one of them. Snow continued to fall beyond the glass, soft and steady, covering the world in quiet white. Inside, warmth gathered not from the heater, not from wealth, but from three people choosing to remain connected. Emily looked up at him one more time before bedtime, her voice calm and certain. "Good night, Dad." Jonathan did not hesitate. "Good night, sweetheart." And in the gentle hum of a small train circling its track, he finally understood that fatherhood was never something you purchased. It was something you stayed for. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next